The third chapter. You have chased God all over this existence and found nothing. I think you will be disappointed in where God has chosen to hide. Not. Deicide was splayed across one of the couches in the lounge area of his wife's lab. He smacked his lips as he tried to bury himself deeper between the comfortable leather cushions. This cozy nook was contrasted by gargantuan industrial machines operating in the background. Not far from where Deicide was, there was an assembly line ejecting hulls for frigates for his massive star fleet. To many, such an armada seemed unnecessary, but no one could guess just what would await the Olopile on the other side of this shrinking existence. Deicide had often asked his wife, what if the higher dimensions were shrinking as well? She had only replied with, they probably are. However, the plane from which they came had collapsed upon itself a mere 100 years after the Olopile's maiden voyage. It would seem that this phenomenon which was devouring the existence must have some sentience, and perhaps a bit of a grudge against them. Visibly frazzled interns sipped coffee from gaudy science-themed personal mugs. They sat around Deicide and spoke to one another as if he were invisible. Strange, as he was the sole recipient, and in a few cases, the only subject of their research. To the medical community, Deicide was a bejeweled lab rat that spit fire and shat golden eggs. Not it turned Deicide's body to a conversion center where pathogens were dropped off and recovered as glorious elixirs, curing every ailment from cancer to old age, even death in some cases. Deicide owed his strange and magnificent biology to abstrusion scientists. The source material from which he was taken, sample 172, and the fine specimen he had been. There was a price for sharing in Deicide's genetic advantage. Certain enhancements broke down the mental autonomy between the patient and Deicide, and few were willing to give up this freedom. Those that did spent the rest of their lives experiencing faint echoes and shadows of Deicide's thoughts, and were more inclined to agree with him than before the treatments. An older scientist, donning a pristinely white lab coat, appeared behind the couch and jabbed Deicide in the ribs with the tip of his pen. "Lord Deicide, I need you back there," he said. His tone was very dry as he looked down at Deicide. Though the nobleman was very liked, even loved by nearly all of Yolopile's crew, his antics and procrastination with the engineers and scientists had forced them to enact a zero-tolerance policy on the man's laziness. It was actually a duty of the most junior interns to always know where the captain was, by tracking device and line of sight. Anything to keep Knott's hammer from dropping, even if it meant treating Deicide like a child. "Ah, vultures," Deicide said as he rose. Yes, sir. All evil knows no limits. Just a few more hours," he said. Deicide used his sharp fingers to scratch himself all over as he followed the white-coated man. They weaved in and out of manufacturing pockets and ongoing projects by Knott's legion of scientists. In this facility alone, there were miles and miles of workbenches, designs thought up by research teams eager to become members of Knott's Somnus Engineering Corps. Intellectually elite, gifted with vision and carefully honed focus, they, led by Knott, were the crafters of Yolophile's technological fate, and they did so with their eyes closed. All around, metal edges were welded together, enormous vats of liquids were poured into molds, surfaces grinded to near transparency. A robotic machine being operated by a Somnus engineer, sleeping soundly in his quarters, was crafting the canine skeletal frame of some pet project. They were completely free to use whatever materials they chose and explore wherever their minds took them. The annoying stench of hot work and polyurethane oils crowded the air. An alarm went off as one of Deicide's tails crossed into the danger zone for the giant robotic equipment surrounding him. "Sir, could you please stay away from the yellow lines? I know your aim is to be as difficult as possible, but I wish you wouldn't take it out on the flying squad," he said. "I like to watch them scramble," Deicide said. Looking at the catwalks fill up with damage control personnel, the building-sized machine within the yellow line had shut down. People were already coming to see if anyone had fallen in. When they had crossed into a quieter section of the facility, Deicide removed his shirt, exposing his supremely defined torso, preparing himself to be gouged with needles and probes. He headed to a group of white lab coats that were huddled around his tiny wife, but Deicide knew that everyone here believed she was the biggest one in the compound. He strolled over playfully and plopped down in a chair that had been set aside for him. wondering what they would be testing today. He was surrounded by a team of researchers in various fields of study. Deicide had been the subject of thousands of studies in his lifetime, beginning with Knott's research. After she had cured Deicide of an array of ailments that were inevitable to immortals, including dementia, she focused her work on the mysterious kill box. Most eaters could not maintain one for very long, even with the aid of the vestige material, but Deicide was among the few who witnessed this phenomenon as reality, and not a fleeting sensation. Besides the most gifted of weavers and risk eaters, most eaters could only use the kill box to perform tricky sleight of hand, or stutter step to fool an opponent. Knott's interns attached a drainage needle near Deicide's bladder to bleed off the vestige well located there. All vestige materials was required to be removed except the oris gland attached to his brainstem. It was a growth that had emerged shortly after Deicide began puberty, allowing him and the abyss to occasionally share senses, until the opening became so wide, neither of them had any secrets between them. Even now, Deicide could hear her incessant whisperings as the abyss poured herself into a large cylinder, so she would not interfere with the tests. Deicide joked quietly with the interns, knowing they could use a bit of a laugh to escape the rigidness and sterility of his wife's work environment. In her own element, Knott was extremely focused and expected the same attitude from everyone in her command. Deicide had long given up trying to lighten her mood when she worked. He watched as she darted back and forth, scribbling on a large digital board with her figures and formulas Deicide had grown tired of seeing. Knott had told Deicide that she was beginning to believe that the vestige was affecting his fertility, that the extreme conditions he created inside his kill box were affecting his sex organs. It was her theory that something was affecting Deicide's sperm, and perhaps the man himself, making it and him selective. Deicide stood as he was waved over by a technician in coveralls. As he came to the man's side, a section of the facility was enlarging. Unneeded projects were shuffled out of the way as the ceiling rose up and the walls ran away from each other. Then various items of different sizes and shapes were brought in, from drinking glasses to the carriage of an oil truck. Though it appeared to be a test just concerning his kill box, in actuality, many tests were taking place. Transparent screens came down just outside of Deicide's maximum kill box range. It was about the size of a football field. "Go ahead, sweetie," Knott shouted from the catwalk directly above. Deicide spread his kill box and began to crush the items within the space. He compartmentalized his attacks, placing an intense gravity on large potted trees until all splintered into a soft pulp, then turning his attention to a set of glasses, lifting and crushing them into crystals with an unseen hand. He forced the glass into a fine powder and let it fall to the ground like snow. He focused on the oil carriage. First it imploded and bent it at its center. Then it was flattened. Knott urged him to go on, and then the metal was formed into a tight ball and pounded into a thick disc. Large androids shot up as if they were fired from cannons in the floor. They twisted and adjusted themselves mid-air, landing with their weapons firing. Deicide lashed out with an umbilical, slicing an arm-mounted machine gun in half. The weapon continued to cycle impotently, unable to fire from the ruined barrels. An unarmed android grabbed Deicide by his waist and attempted to suplex him, but just as the machine hefted him to the Y-axis, Deicide increased his density by a great degree. He fell on top of the android, crushing its entire trunk. As Deicide stood, he dashed away from bullets stitching their way toward him, until he found himself behind his assailant. He allowed the android to turn before he locked grips with the machine. He smiled to his wife on the catwalk, before overpowering the mindless droid with only his muscles to impress his audience. The metal limbs squealed as they were weakened by Deicide's superior force. The smell of the overworked motors poisoned the air. Within seconds, the android reached total failure and dropped into a mess of sparking cables and warped metal. He sat down on the crumpled machine and released a frigid breath from his lips. His umbilicals, now drained of any vestige residue from the action, fell to the deck. His kill box shrank as his body had depleted the bit of vestige fumes in his well. "That's enough," Knott said. The facility began to form itself back into what it just was. Deicide seared over to the elevator to meet his wife as she had descended. The abyss poured herself out of the large vessel she had been contained in, and slid over to Deicide in a high arc, like night stealing the world from the sun. When she had touched his body, her consistency changed, and she became a silky, black shadow once more. Part of her girth seeped into Deicide's umbilicals and brought them to life once more. "Well," Deicide said, shooing away her assistance so that he could be next to his wife. Let them draw a sample. Come back later. Love you, Knott said, kissing him quickly before she hurried off. Deicide groaned as a stone-faced assistant approached him with a needle for semen extraction. And here he had been hoping the two could have lunch together, like the old days, but he remembered that even that was not correct. They had never been alone. She had always brought her work along, and he had been accompanied by the abyss, unable to ever break line of sight with the creature. The thought shoved Deicide's mind into activity. Had he ever actually been alone? Ever? No. There had always been the hum of the engines, the squeak of Knott's test subjects and lab pets, but most of all, there had always been the abyss.